My manager forced me to train my replacement before firing me. He didn't know I owned the software they needed. The humiliation lasted 14 days. That's how long my manager forced me to sit beside the woman replacing me and teach her how to do my job before they planned to fire me. Every morning I had to smile politely while training someone who would soon take my desk, my salary, and the career I spent 6 years building. And the worst part, they thought I was too desperate to fight back. What nobody in that office knew was that the entire department secretly depended on software I personally owned. Software they legally had no right to use without me. So when they finally fired me on a Friday afternoon, they accidentally triggered the most expensive mistake in company history. My name is Emily Dawson. I am 32 years old and I live in Chicago, USA. And this is the story of how my manager tried to replace me quietly, forced me to train my own replacement, and then realized too late that the company's entire system belonged to the person they just fired. I worked for a financial data processing company in downtown Chicago. Fast-paced environment, corporate politics, the kind of place where executives called employees family right before cutting jobs. I started there at 26. Young, driven, eager to prove myself. And honestly, I became very good at what I did. My department handled high-volume reporting systems for investment clients. Massive amounts of sensitive financial data processed daily. Accuracy mattered. Speed mattered. Mistakes could cost millions. Over time, I built internal automation tools to make the work faster, cleaner, more reliable. At first, management loved it. Productivity increased dramatically. Error rates dropped. Clients became happier. And suddenly, everyone treated me like the problem solver of the department. What management didn't care enough to understand was this. I built most of those tools independently, on my own times, using personal development licenses. The company used them daily. But ownership, that remained mine. Legally, documented clearly. At first that never mattered, because I genuinely believed loyalty still existed in workplaces. That was my mistake. Things changed after a new operations manager arrived. His name was Brian Keller. And from the first week, we hated each other professionally. Brian loved control more than competence. He hated employees who understood systems better than he did. Especially women who corrected him publicly. And unfortunately for him, I corrected him often, because he kept making terrible decisions. Every time I raised concerns during meetings, his face tightened slightly. Not enough for HR complaints. Just enough to notice resentment growing quietly. Then came the budget restructuring. Corporate's favorite excuse for betrayal. Departments were told to optimize labor costs. Translation. People were about to disappear. One Monday morning, Brian called me into his office unexpectedly. Smiling, which immediately made me nervous. "We're restructuring team responsibilities," he said casually. Then he introduced me to a younger employee named Chloe. Fresh graduate. Nervous energy. Clearly overwhelmed already. Brian smiled wider. "You'll be training her over the next 2 weeks." The second he said that, I understood. Immediately. I wasn't training support. I was training replacement. Still, I stayed calm. "What position is she taking exactly?" I asked carefully. Brian leaned back in his chair. "Think of it as role evolution. Corporate language again. Meaningless words covering ugly intentions." But then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "We need people who are more adaptable moving forward." Adaptable. Interesting choice of word. Especially coming from a man who barely understood the systems his department depended on. Over the next days, I trained Chloe professionally despite everything. And honestly, I felt bad for her, because she clearly didn't know the full situation. She kept thanking me constantly, asking thoughtful questions, trying hard. One afternoon during training, she quietly asked, "Are you leaving the company?" I looked at her for a second, then answered honestly, "I think the company already decided that." Her face dropped instantly, because suddenly she realized what was happening too. By the second week, the humiliation became impossible to ignore. Meetings I used to lead suddenly excluded me. Access permissions started changing quietly. Managers stopped including me in important emails. And Brian, he loved pretending none of it was obvious. Then came Friday. 4:45 p.m. End of day. Classic firing schedule. Brian and HR called me into a conference room. And before anyone even spoke, I already knew. "We're eliminating your position effective immediately." There it was. 6 years reduced to one rehearsed sentence. HR started talking about severance packages and transition paperwork. But honestly, I barely listened, because my attention locked onto one detail immediately. On the conference room screen behind them, one of my proprietary automation systems was actively running company processes in real time. The same software they believed belonged to them. It didn't. Brian finished his speech with fake sympathy, then added the sentence that changed everything. "Chloe should be able to handle things from here." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was catastrophic. Finally, I asked one simple question. Did legal review software ownership before terminating me? The room went quiet instantly. Brian frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" That's when I realized something beautiful. He truly didn't know. I folded my hands calmly, then said the sentence that completely changed the atmosphere. "The automation systems your department depends on are licensed under my private LLC." Silence. Pure silence. HR looked confused immediately. Brian looked irritated, like he thought I was bluffing. So I pulled out printed documentation from my bag. Licensing agreements, development records, legal ownership filings, everything. And slowly, Brian's confidence started disappearing. "You're lying," he said finally. Weakly, I shook my head calmly. "No," I answered. "You just fired the person legally authorizing your entire processing infrastructure." Nobody spoke for several seconds, because suddenly this wasn't an employee termination anymore. This was a corporate disaster beginning in real time. Then came the best moment of all. The system alert sounded. Loud, sharp, echoing through the conference room speakers. One of my software licenses had automatically entered inactive status the moment my employee credentials were terminated. And somewhere upstairs, the company's processing systems started shutting down. The alert sound echoed through the conference room again. Loud, sharp, impossible to ignore. And within seconds, everyone's phones started vibrating. Brian grabbed his immediately. His expression changed almost instantly. Confusion first, then concern, then panic. "What's happening?" HR asked nervously. Brian stood up quickly without answering. Another alert appeared on the conference room screen behind him. Processing interruption. System authentication failure. Automation routing offline. I watched silently while the realization slowly destroyed the confidence on his face. Because for the first time since I met him, Brian Keller understood he had made a mistake he couldn't talk his way out of. "What did you do?" he snapped. Interesting question, especially from someone who just terminated the person responsible for maintaining the system. I didn't do anything, I answered calmly. The software license automatically deactivates when unauthorized usage conditions are triggered. HR looked horrified now. Unauthorized. I nodded. You terminated the licensed operator. The room became absolute chaos. Phones ringing non-stop. Messages flooding in. Someone outside the conference room literally started running down the hallway. Then another executive rushed into the room without knocking. Face pale. We just lost processing access to 3 major client accounts, he said breathlessly. Then he noticed me sitting there calmly. And suddenly everything clicked for him too. Brian looked furious now. Not confident. Not superior. Just scared and angry. You can't do this, he said. That almost made me smile. Because technically, I hadn't done anything. The company violated licensing terms themselves. I already did, I answered quietly. Maury alerts. Maury system failures. The financial processing queue upstairs had completely frozen now. And every minute offline was costing enormous amounts of money. The executive who entered earlier turned toward Brian slowly. You fired her without checking infrastructure ownership. Brian didn't answer. Because there was no answer good enough. Then came the moment that truly shifted power. My phone rang. Private number. I answered calmly. It was the company's legal department. Ms. Dawson, the attorney said carefully, we need clarification regarding software ownership immediately. Interesting how quickly people become respectful during emergencies. I explained everything clearly. The systems were built independently under my LLC. The company had usage authorization tied directly to my employment and operational supervision. Termination triggered automatic license suspension, exactly as outlined in signed documentation years earlier. Documentation nobody bothered reviewing. The lawyer went completely silent for several seconds, then finally asked, Is there a path to temporary restoration? Translation. Please save us. I looked at Brian while answering. Yes, I said calmly. There's a consulting option. Brian's jaw tightened instantly. Because suddenly the woman he tried replacing became the only person who could stop the disaster. Within an hour, the board itself got involved. Actual executives started arriving in person. Not because they cared about fairness. Because millions of dollars were now at risk. The building atmosphere completely transformed. Panic everywhere. People whispering. IT teams scrambling. Managers running between conference rooms like the company was on fire. Honestly, it basically was. Finally, one board member sat across from me privately. Older man. Calm voice. Very expensive suit. What would it take to resolve this quickly? He asked directly. No fake sympathy. No corporate speeches. Just business. I respected that slightly more. So I answered honestly. First, full acknowledgement that my termination was mishandled. He nodded immediately. Second, an independent consulting contract under my control. Another nod. Third, I continued, Brian Keller is removed from operational authority permanently. That one took longer. But not much longer. Because by then, Brian had already become the obvious scapegoat. Interesting how corporations protect arrogance until it becomes expensive. By the next morning, everything changed officially. Brian was placed under administrative review. Corporate language for career deaths. And me. I returned to the company building not as an employee, but as an external systems consultant. Triple my previous salary. complete authority over software infrastructure, and direct reporting access to the board itself. The irony was beautiful. The same people who quietly watched me get fired now stood up nervously when I entered rooms. Even Chloe looked stunned seeing me return. Poor girl honestly looked relieved. Because she had spent the previous evening drowning in system failures, she never understood fully. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to me privately one afternoon. And surprisingly, I believed her. She wasn't the villain. She was just another employee used by management. So instead of blaming her, I helped her properly. Actually trained her this time. Not as a replacement. As a colleague. Meanwhile, Brian completely disappeared from the office for almost 2 weeks. Rumors spread constantly. Legal reviews. Executive investigations. Financial accountability discussions. Nobody knew the full story. But everyone knew one thing clearly. He underestimated the wrong person. Then one evening, after finishing recovery work late, I saw Brian in the parking garage. First time since the firing. He looked exhausted. Tie loose. Eyes hollow. Like stress had aged him years in days. He stopped walking when he saw me, clearly debating whether to speak. Finally he did. "You embarrassed me," he said quietly. I stared at him for several seconds, then answered calmly, "No, Brian. You embarrassed yourself the moment you believed knowledge was disposable." That hit him harder than yelling ever could. Because deep down, he knew it was true. A month later, Brian officially resigned, though everyone knew resignation wasn't his choice. And as for me, I eventually left the company permanently anyway. But this time, on my terms. Because sometimes revenge isn't destroying a company. Sometimes it's forcing people to finally understand your value after they tried to erase it. And the manager who forced me to train my replacement before firing me, he accidentally trained the entire company to never underestimate the quiet employee holding everything together.